Welcome to Ancient Wisdom. Today, we'll discuss an interesting topic that's complicated and filled with myths. From the battlefields of ancient empires to modern-day conflicts, the gun has been a pivotal force in shaping our world. But its impact goes far beyond warfare. The 20th century saw unprecedented warfare, with guns evolving into powerful machines of destruction. The world witnessed two world wars that reshaped borders and ideologies. But guns also played a role in movements for freedom and justice as individuals fought against oppression. Guns have deep roots in lots of cultures around the world, becoming symbols of power, freedom, and at times, controversy. They've inspired countless stories in film and literature, reflecting society's complex relationship with them. War has always been a brutal affair, but one invention would forever alter its course: the gun. By the 14th century, Europe was introduced to gunpowder. The development of early firearms marked a turning point in military technology. But gunpowder did not originate in Europe. In fact, not even the gun was invented in Europe. Gunpowder and the very first gun was invented in China. Initially used for fireworks and ceremonies, its potential as a weapon would never really be fully reached, and the Chinese never advanced the technology. Europeans realized it could tear down walls a lot more viciously and more accurately than the best mangonel or trebuchet. If the Chinese created gunpowder and the very first gun, it's a very interesting question to ask. Why did China lag behind Europe in gunpowder warfare despite having invented the gunpowder themselves? If you think about it, if you're the Chinese emperor, whose castle or fortification are you trying to demolish? You are China. All of these structures and walls are yours. If you're the King of France, you have German castles on your border in the north, Italians in the southeast, Spanish in the southwest, and English littered through Aquitaine. European nations had to fight each other constantly and were always looking for an edge because of that. This forced them to think of more ways to develop firearms. Europe developed one important technique before China, which was the process of corning gunpowder. Gunpowder was originally just that, a powder, but wasn't reliable as the ingredients could separate and wouldn't work as well. By corning the powder into larger, more stable particles, it became a much more efficient explosive and spurred further development greatly. China had always fought until there was one China left and then stabilized. Europe was always a bunch of kingdoms warring amongst each other and against the Turks in Anatolia and Andalusians in Iberia. Competition bred innovation, which is not something China had as much. Early Chinese firearms in the Southern Song and Mongol Yuan dynasties were limited to rockets, bombs, and grenades. Chinese did use gunpowder in warfare quite a bit. It wasn't until, say, the 17th century or later that the West clearly developed further than China in that department. This is called a tiger crouching cannon. It was probably the most overall common East Asian cannon during the 15th to 17th century. Size may vary, but generally they were much smaller than European cannons of the period, especially towards the later part. Muslim writers of the period record that it came from the east, possibly introduced by the Mongols, so it seems likely that they got it as a consequence of the Mongol expansion as well. China did develop small arms, and they spread along with gunpowder to the west. Up until about 1450, Asia was ahead of Europe in gun technology. Then Europe was slightly ahead until around 1780, because the Ming dynasty was relatively peaceful and didn't need to develop firearms as much. Then Europe pulled far ahead due to the scientific revolution. Early Chinese walls were much thicker and larger than European walls, so they were already cannon-proof. So there was no arms race between artillery technology and fortification technology that lead to increasingly powerful cannons and increasingly larger walls, as there was in Europe. Traditional Chinese city walls, going back 2,500 years, are 5 to 10 meters wide at the base, at least that tall, and built with packed earth, slightly sloping wall angles, and clad in stone. These walls were around every major city, so like 100 were across China. The biggest and best medieval wall in Europe at the same time were the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. Those walls were 4 to 6 meters at the base and 12 meters high. Most European walls were far thinner and shorter. They were also generally built out of stacked stone. When gunpowder weapons first appeared in China, they could spew fire, but couldn't do anything to the existing city walls. Even in World War II, modern Japanese artillery had trouble against some of these ancient walls. This meant that China developed a ton of gunpowder-based anti-personnel weapons over the next few hundred years, but as siege weapons, gunpowder was a dead end. In 1453, the Ottomans built a 7.3-meter cannon that could only be fired once every 3 days. It took 3 hours to reload and fired a single 1,200-pound stone. It took 90 oxen and 400 men to move it. This is what they thought they needed for the Theodosian walls, which, again, was equivalent to a slightly thin, slightly tall Chinese city wall. The Chinese didn't see the point of trying to make a cannon that big. In Europe, it was different. The first cannons that appeared could knock down European walls. Even if they couldn't, it was very clear that a slightly better, slightly more powerful cannon definitely could. They developed the art of putting a ball in a tube with explosives. They pioneered ballistics. In China, they saw the European cannons coming back and copied them. They still couldn't do anything to Chinese walls in the 1600s, but they were still useful. The Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans also developed effective musketeer troops in the 1600s. What they didn't have, though, was the European science of ballistics. The existence of the sound barrier and its effect on low-velocity versus high-velocity projectiles could only be discovered through careful testing. The other problem was that China lacked peer competition in the 1700s. There wasn't any equally powerful rivals that could threaten the Chinese state. Chinese progress in arms technology stagnated in the late 1700s at exactly the time the Europeans were making greater and greater leaps. Gunpowder and firearms were Chinese inventions, but their development in China was constrained by a lack of scientific theory and experimentation. The guns used by the Qing forces in the Opium War were copies of Western weapons that had been introduced to China during the Ming period. The story remains similar for the Qing, who imported a lot of foreign weapon. Again, the need for innovation was not that pressing, but more problematically, when European imperialism began to make itself felt after 1840, the Qing state itself was structurally suffering. The problem thus becomes more than just lacking modern technology. The body of the state itself was problematic, bogged down by corruption and mismanagement. Europe at the time had fully embraced the Industrial Revolution and soared past its competitors for the first time since the 1800s. At the time when an active need for innovation presented itself, the state itself was spiraling into crisis. I think it has somewhat to do with how we think of it. Often people think of it as a linear progression of technology. That's not really the case. Inventions like gunpowder doesn't have an inherent value, but that value gets added by the society that adopts them. If it doesn't have a use for it, or the systems in place are better or resistant to change, then existing usage of technology stays the same. It's with some hindsight now that we can look back and see a linear progression of gunpowder that enabled its owners to conquer others. But that's not how innovation or technology works. It's not a guaranteed improvement. Nor is it always clear that the adoption of new technology is beneficial. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next video.